BlomCast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Hello and welcome to the BlomCast, the podcast that looks at changing points in history. And yes, here's another episode. Now there is a little glut of them. I've been finishing a book and therefore I've been silent for a while. But now I've got some really wonderful guests lined up, none more wonderful than Katy Hessel, who is here to talk with me about the story of art without men. But in the few minutes that we've just had to chat, we found that we may also talk about one or two other things. So, Katy, welcome.
Thank you so much, Philip. It's an honor to be here.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to talk to you. Listen, we didn't even finish our conversation before because I thought that we would be talking about the story of art without men, and we may do that. But you also said, have you heard of my new book? And no, I hadn't heard of your new book. So what have you got in the works? This is traditionally the question you ask at the end of the interview, but let's just turn the tables and ask it right now.
Well, I'm still working everything out, but I was very interested in your podcast episode recently about subjugating the earth and systems. And recently I went to see an exhibition at the Serpentine Gallery in London by an artist called Judy Chicago. And she's famous for making this extraordinary work called The Dinner Party, which is permanently housed in the Brooklyn Museum. They bought it in 2007. It was made between 1974 and 1979. And it's basically this giant minimalist structure, a triangular structure that as if it awards 39 women from mythology and history a seat at the table. So in this table, you find Artemis Gentileschi, the fabulous Baroque artist Georgia O'Keeffe, Virginia Woolf, Emily Dickinson, Cleopatra, etc., etc.
What a crowd.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Dream dinner party. And then in the middle of it are 999 names of further women from history. And actually it's brilliant because it really kind of plays on this idea of, first of all, the domestic, the dinner table, but also everyone's got their own name place with a very sort of Ionic shaped ceramic plate, fork and knives, and then a sort of, and then a name place, a mat. And this really plays on this idea of how much the establishment had really cut out or deemed derogatory and negative women's work and craft and dismissed it as decorative arts. But what Judy Chicago's doing is she's reclaiming the needle, the ceramic, the plate, the domestic item as a form of protest. And so it's really this extraordinary piece. But a very long-winded way of saying that I went to her exhibition recently at the Serpentine, and so much of it is about, what if women ruled the world? What if God was a gender-neutral figure? How different would our systems in our world be, but also how different would our approach to nature be? And I was so hooked on your episode, and I know that this is the subject of your new book, which I'm so thrilled about, which is going to be translated into English.
It's already been translated. It's about to come out. I'm very excited about that.
Amazing. But this idea that, why do we kind of accept these certain penetrations in the world? Why do we accept these hierarchies in these systems? And why do we accept the fact that we are higher than the animals too? It's not just a gender thing. It's not just a race thing, but it's the way we actually treat our earth. And that comes back to the care we have for each other and the planet.
Which brings us to your book.
Exactly. So, Judy Chicago features heavily in the book. And I should add that, my book traces the last 500 years of art without men.
Only that.
But also I feel terrible because it's such a kind of fraction of the women who contributed this to the story of art. And also there are so many more stories of it. But I really came to this idea because when I was a teenager, I adored a book and pored over a book called The Story of Art by E.H. Gombrich.
I lived around the corner from Gombrich in London, and we often went past his house and saw him sitting there in a big armchair, this bald head you could see from the window, reading some book, and thought, oh, there's Mr. Gombrich. And we, of course, we never went any further, but it was a very nice thing. And yes, here, of course, I am sitting at the place where he was born in Vienna. But yes, such an iconic history of art. And just for our listeners who perhaps haven't read it or who are too young to have read that book, that is, you are of that generation, but you are an art historian, you have read more widely. But Ernst Gombrich was a brilliant art historian, and he made things enormously accessible and was very unsnobbish, but also very penetrating. But he also wasn't great on women.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, the first edition of his book, which was published in 1950, included 0 women, and only the 16th edition included just 1. And, my book is not to damn or censor Gombrich in the slightest. If anything, it's to celebrate him and honour him. It's just to say that, okay, his is kind of the story of art without women. So just like he left out women, I thought I'd leave out men.
Look, I mean, 2 things that are astonishing about your book. First of all, I mean, it's wonderful to see a demonstration that, yes, you can perfectly well tell the entire story of art through the work of women. Disadvantaged as they were structurally for so long, there were enough of them to really have work of wonderful quality in every period and every style. You can completely tell the history of art through the eyes of women and using only women. Also, of course, how these women were written out of history, because, it's funny, I grew up with a very strong mother, and she was a singer, but she also was of the opinion that really, of course, there weren't any women artists because women didn't have that kind of genius. They were not creative in that way, perhaps, or, she sort of hedged when I was asking as a kid. But, it was clear that she was sort of uncomfortable. At the same time, of course, she was of the generation of the 70s feminist revolution, which really addressed that for the first time. And, when I got your book in my hands for the first time, I must confess that I thought, why does she write this now? Hasn't that been done 50 years ago? Why would that still be necessary? But oh my God, how necessary it is. Because if you look still at the structures, at museums, at the art market, at, how you can make your living as a woman artist, really not that much has changed.
I know. And the thing is, I really stand on the shoulders of all those fantastic women who came in the 70s. And actually, my project, about women artists was actually born on Instagram, because, again, it was one of those things where I went to so many different sort of companies and publications, but no one was really taking an interest. And so I thought, okay, I was 21 years old. What did I have access to? And what could I do myself? Was actually upload works onto Instagram and write about them every single day. And I called my Instagram account The Great Women Artists, which very much pays homage to Linda Nochlin, who was a trailblazing feminist art historian who penned the essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists in 1971, which really looked at this concept of greatness and the social structures that had kept women out from, being perceived as having this greatness or being part of the story of art. And, I think what's so exciting about this project is that it's, in a way, it's a conversation across generations and across time, and we're all doing something else. And I hope that we're all working towards something. And it just, these things take a while, and we need all of us to work together and push forth to make sure that people know about them. In the 1970s, it was such an interesting time, especially for artists. I mean, first of all, it was a time where women really came together to protest their kind of outrage at being excluded from the establishment. But also, it was also a time when, in terms of what they were making, they went away from the establishment, because they said, okay, if you're not going to let us in to this temple of knowledge, which is, no doubt probably this very kind of neoclassical structure based on the Parthenon, and what does the Parthenon represent? All these very interesting things. There's linear of classicism that comes with it. But also they were going to take to the land. This fantastic Cuban artist called Ana Mendieta spoke about how the earth was the canvas and her body was her tool. And this idea of imprinting yourself on the soil, because it was devoid of patriarchal structures. And it was so inventive. And I think we just see that time and time again. And now what's phenomenal is that museums and establishments are coming round to it. Can you believe that in the 256 years that the Royal Academy of Arts in London has been open, they have finally had a solo exhibition by a woman artist in their main galleries? And while that might be shocking, it is also progress. And so I think, hopefully for the first time, we have a woman in charge of Tate. We have a woman in charge of the Louvre, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And actually, it's all this work that has been done in the past that is all pushing towards a brighter, more exciting, accessible and interesting future where everyone can feel like they can be part of it.
Let me just drag us back into the past, because here's a really interesting point I thought you made. And, I'm sort of trying to look at turning points in history, and I think this is not so much a turning point, but it's an axis throughout history that changes. We know perfectly well why women artists were underrepresented, because it was almost impossible for them to work. And that is also very different across the different kinds of, the different genres of art, the different media. By the way, very similar for Jewish artists. But basically, for instance, for the longest time, to become a painter, you had to be apprenticed by a master, you had to become part of a guild, and those were all solidly masculine structures, and you couldn't really work away from that unless you were lucky enough that your father was a painter, such as Artemisia's father or many others. And you could be taught sort of away from that. But also, painting cost a lot of money. You had to have a studio, you had to have freshly mixed paints, expensive pigments, etc. So, you had to run a whole business in order to do this, which made it even more difficult and forced some of these women to become miniaturists and things like that. Writing was a lot easier because all you needed was a quill and a piece of paper. Composing was almost impossible because you needed to have access to an orchestra or a whole choir or something like that. And of course, that is, those are immensely expensive features. But what I found astonishing is that you show that against all this and despite all this, there were throughout history hugely successful women artists who were famous, highly paid, who was sought after by the poshest patrons, the greatest princes.
The Pope?
And the Pope, well, I mean, if that is a measuring stick to go by, but and yet once they died, once their careers were over, they completely dropped out of history, and people no longer heard about them, but they heard about the second and third ranked male painters.
I mean, it's so interesting because it's all about who has gotten to write art history, and so I know you say all you need is a piece of paper and a quill to write. But you also need a lot more.
You need a room of one's own, perhaps, as Virginia Woolf found.
You need a room of one's own, but you also, it's so interesting. The book did quite well in England, and I wonder if, and it was sort of born from my Instagram, and I wonder how much the internet has to do with the kind of rise of the democratization of art. Whereas I totally just see myself as a tiny person in this. But, the fact that more women artists, more people of colour are being recognised more than ever because we have these kind of we have these very democratic platforms that are in a sense non-hierarchical. I remember when I was about 23 and I met the Tate modern director, Frances Morris, at an airport in New York City, and I couldn't believe it. And I went up to her and I said I was such a fan, and she later came on my podcast to talk about Agnes Martin, one of the great artists of the 20th century. But actually, through Instagram, I was able to directly contact her, and suddenly all these kind of power structures broke down, and what was left were these fantastic two people with this fantastic passion for art, and it doesn't matter who you are or what position you are, you both believe in something so much, and that kind of intergenerational conversation can happen. And actually, when you have people working of different generations and different backgrounds, that is when change happens. I think change doesn't happen when you have these power structures that have just, kept systems in place for generations and generations. What you want is to blow that wide open, because then you get more perspectives and it becomes so much more exciting. And actually, then you can work together in terms of making change collectively.
Isn't this interesting? I mean, it's such a wonderful, optimistic story. And you talk about social media. And of course, we also know of all the mischief social media are causing. And it's very much about the same thing, namely about the gatekeepers. And the gatekeepers, where news are concerned, for instance, are, I think, quite a meaningful and important thing. to vet whether a story is actually based on facts and can be verified from different sources, and therefore we will invest our credibility in it? Or is it just some, embittered teenager sitting in front of a computer, or an embittered 60-year-old sitting in front of a computer and hacking in hate? But you make the point that the gatekeepers going away and the gatekeepers losing their power, as in the museum directors, the art professors, etc., also means that a completely new flourishing of creativity can happen, of artistic networks, artistic connections between people.
I wouldn't necessarily say it's the museum directors losing their power. I think it's more to say that they retain their power, but I think more people just join the conversation.
No, but the gatekeepers as the male gatekeepers of an art world, they were all men.
Of course, but I think what I find also exciting, because I know lots of male gatekeepers who of art history, and actually how open-minded they are, and actually how they've said, oh my gosh, I can't believe I've been the director of this museum for X amount of times, and I'm suddenly seeing something anew. And actually I think it's also making sure that we never sort of judge anyone for saying you only know as much as you know. And what is exciting, if anyone's listened to this podcast, is clearly that you have a hunger to learn new stories. And it doesn't matter if you're in your 90s or you're in your teens. But I also think that it's, you touched on something quite important, which is about embracing different people and different generations. And, I was 21 when I started my project. And, it's very interesting. I don't know when this podcast is going to launch, but I spent the whole morning listening to the news, and Kamala Harris is running for president for this year. And all the journalists ask people who are her friends, mostly black women who are being interviewed, well, what about the older white man? What about his feelings? And I thought, but why don't we ask, what about the young people? What about that person? What about the gay person, the disabled person? Why is the perspective always the default man? And I just think we have to change the way that we're asking these questions, because actually when you do that, you include so many more people, and also then we don't kind of vilify different people or say, what about the older white man who's a working class man? Well, guess what? He might actually be up for embracing new stories and new changes. And I think it's all about making sure that we never judge anyone and say, okay, there's been this huge, this huge gap in history, but we're filling it now, and we're all together in this, and we need everyone on board in order to make that change.
You embarked on this project, and often when you research a project like that, of course, you don't really know what you let yourself in for. And you find stuff you never thought you would find. You find also that perhaps things that you thought would be terribly important really sort of go into the background. But what really surprised you about the story that you were telling?
I'll also tie that in with a question about what was the most frustrating thing. It was the fact that my book wasn't long enough. I needed 100 volumes to fill. And I think what surprised me was that there were so many women, and the resilience and the strength that they had to just keep going and keep fighting and telling their story on such an extraordinary level. One of my favorite, I'm in love with every single artwork in the book and every artwork by the artists. But, one of my favorite artists is a German artist called Charlotte Salomon, a Jewish artist. And she made this extraordinary work called Life or Theatre, which is essentially kind of over 700 gouaches.
It was an amazing exhibition at the Royal Academy many years ago of her work. I saw it there. It was absolutely stunning.
Would you ever have sort of, I feel like for me that is great art. It's her perspective of what life was like growing up as a Jewish teenager in the rise of the Nazi regime in the 1930s. And she tells this such emotional story about dealing with her family's mental health, her family's suicides and suicide attempts, but also what it's like falling in love and seeing the world, but also running away from the Nazis. And it's just these extraordinary experiences of people who actually show you firsthand what it was like to actually be that person, be a woman. during the Second World War. And I think what I love about looking at art by women especially is that, unlike a source or a text or a speech that might have been manipulated and maybe exaggerated, or maybe, we're not so sure if Virginia Woolf gave that speech or whatever, or maybe someone a bit further back. But actually, when we see that picture, that is by that artist. And it shows the first-hand experience of what it was like to witness these events. And, you mentioned earlier Artemisia. Artemisia Gentileschi was this extraordinary artist working in the 17th century Baroque period. And she shows she kind of has this extraordinary career where she grows up in Florence, she's in Rome, she is invited by King Charles to England. She's huge. In an international celebrity in her time, people were so obsessed with her, they painted pictures of her hand because they thought it had such divinity. And she paints these heroic women like the Susannas, the Judiths, the Lucretias.
She was also raped and then tortured to prove that she was really raped, so that she wasn't lying. So the hands may have also had another significance because it was the hands that were tortured.
Exactly. But what she does is she tells these stories from a female perspective. And so as a woman, I feel like 400 years ago, there was someone who was kind of on our side, basically. I don't know. And I just think, they show us the truth of lived experiences. And I think that's why we go to art,
Now, this is a very interesting thing because, when I talk about art, I always try to, and live in a very Catholic country, and people's perspective here is still instinctively steeped in that, even if people may no longer be actively religious. And, so the question is for many people, but, all that sacred art, that is so wonderful. Doesn't it mean that it must represent some kind of truth? And, it's very easy to say, but look who the patrons were at the time. And the church was the greatest commissioner of artwork, threw around most money. And of course, if you worked for the church, you had to paint what the priests wanted you to paint. And you could infuse that with your own meaning by almost subverting your commission in many interesting ways, as art history shows us. But also, the conventions were just overwhelming. If you wanted to have naked bodies, you basically had to choose a mythological subject. Then you were allowed to show nudies, and etc., etc. If you wanted to have a gay icon, you have to paint Saint Sebastian and have him suffer particularly intensely. But the range of things that could be depicted and treated in art was very limited. And of course, women also had to work within that framework of a very narrow range of subjects that could be depicted in a technique that was quite narrowly defined when and where they were working. So in how far did they still manage to infuse something of their own perspective, of their own lived reality into these works?
This is such an interesting question and something that I really want to explore more.
Sorry that the question is so long.
No, I love it. I love it because also because in a way it's however you read the passage in the Bible. I mean, do you read it as Eve who took the apple and caused the fall of mankind for humanity and got us banished from the garden? Or do you read it as a woman who was curious and wanted to access knowledge? And actually maybe being banished from the garden was a wonderful thing, because who wants to live in paradise anyway? Because guess what? Life is more exciting when it's up and down and heaven and hell and all these different things. And so I think it's all about how we read it. It's similarly with the Susanna story, right? So the story of Susanna and the Elders, which is a very famous and ubiquitous image in art history because it allows for the semi-naked Susanna. It's from the book of Daniel, and it follows the young virtuous woman Susanna who's bathing in her garden when two lecherous men try and abuse her and seduce her. And yes, you could read that as many have, for example Rubens or something, as a sort of a seductive woman asking for these men to kind of chase her. And, oh my God, she's so young and she's got this gorgeous kind of transparent drapery and she just wants to invite men. Or you could read it as an image of rape. And that is what Artemisia Gentileschi did. Because that, for me, when I'm reading that passage in the Bible, which I have, that is how I see it. And so it's so interesting because although, yes, people might have different interpretations, but it's the fact that those interpretations, the seductive woman, Eve as a temptress, have been told time and time again. So it becomes sort of default in our mind. Whereas actually what we are seeing is it can be also the opposite. In a way, these passages give us the answers for anything, but it's all about our interpretation. And so we always need art by a wide range of people. Otherwise, we're not seeing these perspectives as a whole.
Now, I'm just thinking of the fact that my wife, Veronica, who was just writing a book about the seven daughters of Empress Maria Theresa. No, that's actually not true. Here's an announcement to the world. She has finished her book 3 days ago. Hooray.
Please, can I read it? That sounds fantastic.
You must. I think it will be fantastic. And but why I'm asking, she is an avid museum goer, and she says, very often I come into a room and I find myself drawn to one particular painting, and I find out it's painted by a woman. Do you think there's something like that is a shared sensibility? I don't mean some essential femininity, but a social experience, a shared cultural experience, a shared growth of perspective that means that there is such a thing as a female perspective in art?
I think it's such a good question, and I think that it can apply to so many different things. But I do believe that there is a kind of default male and patriarchal perspective, and I also don't say that every man has this as well. It's a patriarchal perspective, not a male perspective. And I think that when you're so kind of used to seeing certain images in the world, and then you suddenly notice that there's another angle, I think that's how you're drawn to it. Maybe I'm not explaining this very well. I think that there's nothing inherently different about art by different genders, but I think there is something different by the fact that our gatekeepers historically have chosen to talk about one single narrative. And so when you see that glimmer of a different perspective, you might warm to it. And perhaps that perspective might be a woman's. And, it depends. Any gender can also have that approach to it. You might have that approach to it and see something else. But I don't see gender that differently in terms of an artwork itself. I see it differently in how people have told the story of art. But actually, why I wrote this book is because I want everyone to look at it and everyone to have their take on it. And actually, when you see these takes on these artworks and these perspectives, I think that actually it will enrich your life. Because if you're missing out, if you don't pay attention to these artworks, to my mind, you're just missing out on great art.
That's what national education systems do for people. They don't allow them to access all that wonderful treasure that is there for them.
But that's the thing. It's like even with the Eve story, it's like that excitement of curiosity. I think the imagination and curiosity is the greatest gift. It's like, Pandora, she doesn't have to plague humanity with the world. She doesn't have to plague humanity with, sickness and everything. She can show us wonder. And I think we have to look at things from different perspectives. And it's exciting. As I said at the beginning, I've finished a little book, and it's actually a book about hope, which is completely uncharacteristic for me. I've written a series of letters to a young person about what hope can mean in a time like today. I hope it's quite an interesting book. I had a good time writing it, but I talk about the Pandora story in there because, of course, Pandora has all the evils of the world unleashed in the world out of her little box. And what is left in the box is Elpis, is hope. And you first of all ask yourself, what is hope doing bunched in with all the evils of the world? And then you find out that the ancients didn't look at hope that positively in a way, but also that, this was actually this is the beginning of women being written out of history as creative beings. Because, of course, Pandora, who brings all the evils over the world, is very connected to Eve, who does the same.
as a woman, because she's a woman, and she's sent into the world to bring all evil. And on the other hand, the Pandora's box is actually Pandora's clay jar, or Pandora's earthenware jar in the original Greek. And that was very symbolic of a womb and of the earth, and hope being left in there and being born from that is a completely different image than the Pandora we grow up with. It is the goddess that had temples in Greece dedicated to her, because she was showered with gifts by all gods, Pandora. And it is so fascinating to see how these stories, from the very beginning of our culture, are flipped around to make women agents of evil, make women not creative. And what is much more fascinating to me, I mean, I find that fascinating because I'm an historian and I'm interested in that stuff. And in, that, as you very kindly mentioned, that book and podcast about subjugation, that is about the patriarchal male view of the world that is at the moment perishing in the climate crisis, I believe. But it is so interesting to see how even people who would see themselves as perfectly enlightened and progressive have these perspectives baked in so deeply that it's really hard to think differently. Do you make that experience?
I do, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I also genuinely believe, and I am hopeful, that actually, I hate the word and I hate bringing it up, but this idea of woke culture or whatever, and I think that people are so misunderstood, because actually, and I really hate the term, but it's more like, let's turn it into hope, and this idea that we are so much stronger in a more hopeful, inclusive world. The people who are sort of stamping on progressiveness and saying we don't want it to happen, they don't. I want to open their mind and say, actually, it will benefit you. I never understand. I mean, call me a complete naive optimist, but people sort of at war, writing about certain things, and I just think, oh my God, look at it this way, and your life would be so much freer. I don't know. I mean, I'm not an art critic, but I love to. I write about art, but I always also want to do it in a kind of hopeful way.
There's a really nice malicious argument that I like about this. Let me just look something up, because it's, in fact, I'm just looking for a name, and here we go. Yes, it's Musa al-Gharbi who made that point, an American academic, and he talks about elite overproduction, which I think is a very nice point to make at universities. And he says basically the humanities are educating so many people, far more than their jobs for them, in the academe, that you have to find something that becomes a political instrument for shoring up your influence. And to some degree, the insistence on an ideologically pure woke culture can also be a career instrument for people, to push other people out of the way and to form networks that work in academe and perhaps take over academe. I don't find that such a stupid idea, I must say, because I observe the ideologicization of the humanities I'm very troubled by it, I must say. I think the humanities are almost about to abolish themselves in many ways. I mean, in Britain, tragically so, also because of funding, but also because of, I find, an increasingly ideological stance in many areas of academia, which, combined with the fact that your job is precarious, that your job is time limited, that you have to publish in the right journals, that you have to sometimes organize your own money for your research, means that original, bold research is not encouraged.
There are so many thoughts on that. I mean, I'm not an academic.
Fortunately, and neither am I, Katy, but this is the reason why. Because I didn't want to play that game. And I see, things like cultural appropriation, which certainly come from a good place, because you want to protect vulnerable people from their heritage being taken away and ridiculed and turned into money by people who are already powerful. But on the other hand, what is art other than cultural appropriation? Then taking and stealing from other people who've come before you, and from being inspired by that, from exercising empathy and trying to understand who someone else was. And you said earlier, as a woman, I find fantastic to see my perspective reflected in the 17th century. But of course, you've never been a 17th century woman. And so perspectives, if you don't allow for the profound power of empathy to carry you across those historical thresholds, you might as well stop looking at historical art, or indeed at art altogether. So I think, we live in a sort of perhaps progressive bubble in the humanities. We live also in times where ideology has become so important, where saying the right thing in the right way has become so important, that I find that intellectually quite stifling.
Well, firstly, your point earlier about everyone vying for the same jobs, I think that it's not about to blame the humanities, it's about blaming the structures in which the humanities operate. And so in a way, we need to kind of blow that right open. And I also, it goes right back to the Greeks and thinking about someone like Athena, and Athena wanting to be the only woman who the men accepted. And it very much speaks to this idea that only one woman can have that job, or that person has to get that job. And actually, so much of the time, I don't know if I'm explaining this very well, but in a company or something, oftentimes it will be much harder for a woman to get to the top, and actually she'll have to work on her own a lot more because there is only one place for the woman, and it really stems back to that. And similarly with I mean, I don't know how academia works, but this idea that everyone has to get that particular job or has to be in that journal. Well, what about just stepping outside?
In this world, you can't afford to, because if your tenure is basically the Holy Grail.
Yeah.
If you want to get anywhere near tenure, you need to have a tenure track position, you need to publish in the right journals. To have access to the right journals that have the right amount of impact points, you need to please the editors of that journal, and you need to survive a peer review process, which means that if you write anything that's controversial, you will be shot down. You have to write something that is utterly trivial, but in a very technically sophisticated way, with lots of methodology and lots of footnotes and so. And if it's trivial enough, it'll come through. And if you publish enough of that, I had friends, I was living in California, working at the Getty Institute for a year, and we had very good friends who were very, young art historians on their way, and he had a tenure track position in Houston, and she had a position in San Francisco, and they had a 2-year-old son. How are you supposed to have a family, a future? How are you able to plan for your future and even to be together as a couple under those circumstances? So, it is such intense pressure, and it is such intense pressure to produce stuff that is squeezed from the right mold in order to be, a vehicle in a world of exceedingly precarious careers, that I'm not surprised that you're not an academic. I mean, you could probably walk into a number of wonderful jobs, but it's very limiting. And it's very hard. And you are probably, you are certainly able to have much more fun and write about, for instance, women from all millennia. I have just written a book going back, 6,000 years. I'm not an expert in any of that stuff, but, you can read up on stuff. And as you see in your excellent bibliography, you can do your homework, and then you can write about that well. But not in an academic context. I think that's over, and I think that's a tragedy.
Yes. I mean, I can't speak to the academic world. I can speak to the idea and the importance of humanities and art in education elsewhere, and also in the wider world as well, and the importance of prioritizing humanities as a subject because of how it can, as you know, impact rational thinking, impact empathy, impact social skills, impact how we treat the world, how we think and grow to learn different perspectives. What I don't know is the academic world. But I think what art can show us, whether you have never stepped inside a museum or you are an expert in something, I think that everyone can be moved by art and it can tell us something new. And also, you mentioned earlier this, I don't know what it was like to have this perspective of a 17th century woman, but it's the fact that these artworks still exist now. And actually, we can also see them we're also allowed to view them from our perspective as a 21st century woman as well. And so I think it's a kind of, there are so many layers to this.
Well, absolutely, there are. But let me try out another idea on you, because you say anybody can walk into a gallery and be moved by something. But I would say, art is, any kind of art is its own language. And it's a language that you can learn. And then you maybe perhaps moved in a different way, or you may learn more about why you were moved in the first place. It's something that is worth learning. That grammar, that vocabulary of different kinds of art. And I think it's the job of education to get kids to have a handle on that, to get a basic vocabulary of art, to carry around with them in their lives, because it will make their life so much more rich, as you say. It will give them so much more. It will give them a key to unlock so much stuff. When I was living in London, I was at the Royal Academy, and there was a really interesting show on about all the work that was at the World Exhibition 1900 in Paris. So you saw what was thought was important in 1900, and of course it was very entertaining to see that. I don't know how many women there were. That would be interesting to see. Not a lot, one or two perhaps. But also, the Picassos of this world were completely in a sort of little niche, because they weren't thought important. But I remember standing in front of one image together with a school class from Berlin, and they had asked me to lead them around the exhibition. And it was a Spanish painting that made a comment on this terrible situation, poverty in Spain, and there had just been a famine. And you saw a woman with a baby on her arm, and the baby was dead, and she was in front of a devastated landscape. And these kids from East Berlin, this was just after the wall fell, so they had had an East German GDI education in art. And I asked them, so what do you see? And they said, well, it's a woman. I said, yes, and she's got a baby. Yes, and the baby appears to be dead. Yes. What else do you see? Nothing really. And, the fact was, of course, this was a riff on a Madonna with child, and on all the beauty and all the promise that that image had, especially in a deeply Catholic country. And now you saw a woman with a dead child in front of a devastated landscape. Anybody who had grown up in a Catholic language of imagery would have understood that immediately. For these kids, it was a completely different painting, and one they couldn't decipher because they didn't have those keys. Don't you think it's the responsibility of schools to give kids those keys?
I mean, it's very interesting because I don't know, also think about different faiths. The Madonna and Child might be the default for Catholic countries, but also
A Pakistani girl might think differently.
Exactly.
Yes.
And actually, I think that's the exciting thing is that actually I think the most important thing we do is to teach kids how to look and how to look further. I don't think they have to have the answers. I think it's about, like you said, what do you see? Okay, how does that make you feel? Okay, does it relate to something in your life? Do you see, the art history is the visual history of the world through an individual's lens, or the history of art. And I've actually interestingly just written a kid's book that's coming out next year.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and it's the story of Art Without Men for kids, and it was so brilliant to do because also, I remember I wrote this chapter about the Royal Academy and how there were 2 female founder members, and if you look at this first image of all the founder members, you'll notice that the 2 women, Mary Moser and Angelica Kaufman, are not in the scene with all the men who are in suits in the life room. They are immortalised as these portrait stone busts in the wall because they were not allowed in the life room. And what else did the Royal Academy exclude? It excluded tapestry, embroidery. And so actually, let's not look at the people who made these kind of academic style paintings that were hailed. Let's actually look at the embroidery, which could have been part of this story. And so so in a way, I think, I mean, I don't know the answers at all. But I think that, as you say, giving kids the keys.
No, but answers are also boring.
Yes, but the key is unlocking it, and then you can see through and you can see more, and the door opens a bit further and a bit further.
You mean I just don't have enough keys?
Have more keys. You know, it's so exciting, and I think I'm totally with you in that it should be an integral part of our curriculum, because also it makes you see stories in a different way and understand the world in a different way, and positions as well. And you know, these temples, I don't know about where you live, but where I live in England, the reason why I'm an art historian is because I grew up in London where the museums were free. So every Saturday, that's what I would do, as take myself off. And actually, because it was that and it didn't cost any money, I was able to educate myself. And I think that's something that teenagers can do, and they should know that they can do it, and they are welcome there.
Absolutely. So any teenagers who may be listening, off to the next museum. They are free, very probably in the place you are. They certainly are in London and in Vienna. Katy, you described that you came in one art fair, and that was a sort of epiphany for you because you saw that there were no female artists represented at all. You had studied art history. Hadn't you encountered that before? Or so was your art history course so old-fashioned that you could have had it in the 1950s?
Well, it depends. I also blame my ignorance. You know, it was my ignorance to not see further than what I was looking at. It took until my third year, when I was writing my dissertation on Alice Neel, who's a fantastic American portraitist who was working from the 1930s to the 1980s, for me to realise that women artists especially were recognised right at the end of their life, or perhaps even after they've already lived. And in a way, it was almost like this puzzle. You know, I did learn about some women artists at university, but not enough. And actually, you know, like I say, I can also blame myself at not actually putting that puzzle together to realise the pieces were kind of dispersed.
Yeah, but blame is never very interesting.
It took for that kind of epiphany moment at the art fair to say, actually, can I name 20 women artists off the top of my head? Can I name any pre-1850? And the answer was no. And that's when I decided, I literally couldn't sleep that night, to get up my phone and begin my Instagram account, which I've been doing pretty much every day since, and educate myself, because I think that's, you know, if you see something that's missing, go after it and use the resources that you've got as well. Never be precious about anything. My first exhibition I curated was in a foyer of an advertising agency, you know, and it was a huge hit. 1,000 people came on opening night, and I've now curated shows at museums and galleries. But, you know, everyone's got to start somewhere. And I think something to always remember, especially young people, because or any age, to be honest, nothing ever happens overnight.
One other thing that I took away from your book, and by the way, your Instagram feed is fantastic and I follow it every day.
Thank you.
One other thing I noted, you know, this business of stuff being written out of history. And by the way, after this little musing, you said that you wanted to turn the tables and interview me, and that you had questions as well. You're very welcome to do that, of course. What the hell did I want to say now? Oh, yes. This business of very important things being written out of history. I mean, we know that the famous cliche that history is written by victors. And the defeated, the vanquished, they never get a look in. And we also know that history is trying to change that now. Historians are trying to change that now. People like you and I, perhaps, who are trying both to write history from different perspectives. I mean, for me, it was, you know, very much the history of the Enlightenment, and the fact to see that, you know, what we call today the Enlightenment is a very anemic, bloodless parody of the huge riot of thought that was going on in the 17th and 18th century that, yes, involved women, and that involved atheists and materialists and Republicans and all sorts of exciting people who've been written out of the history books, which were written in the 19th century by men with huge beards, and, which basically sort of created an intellectual ancestry for the bourgeoisie, for the property-owning bourgeoisie, with people like Voltaire and Kant, and you see a book about Voltaire there behind me, being the sort of patron saints of a timid deist enlightenment that was rationalist and said, we are all basically brains on stilts, and everything else is can be ignored. Well, I think the Enlightenment was a completely different period than this historical portrait shows, and I've written about that, and, I come back to it again and again. You have made the point very eloquently about how women, and also successful women, that's the interesting thing, famous women, have been eradicated from history. Where are you looking in history for the next really exciting thing? I mean, I'm working also now about getting the interaction between humans and nature into history. I'm not the only one. There's lots of people who've come before me who've done that. But no longer to look at history as something humans do to other humans, but that is happening between humans and the ecosystems they live in. And that also shapes human interaction. But where, from your perspective, what makes you most curious, where you think, here's something we haven't explored yet, here's a story that we haven't told yet, and I'm really excited about seeing what that might be?
I think that's such a beautiful way of saying it about, the history of humans and nature. And I think it's so integral that we change the way we think. And also, I think also we wouldn't also be here if it wasn't for the so-called Enlightenment. It's everything is a building block, really. The main thing is that we just keep going in the right direction, that is going to make the world better for those who we leave it to eventually. I always think leave the world in a better state than from when you found it. And I think you are doing that so beautifully. I think what I'm interested in is, endlessly art, but also the subjects of art I'm very interested in. I'm teaching myself classics. I've been learning classics for the last year. And the Bible and, these stories. I want to sort of understand these stories, and I want to understand structures. And that's kind of where I want to go next. But also I want to, I look to art for the answers for a lot of things, to show me the way, if that sort of sounds a little religious. But in a way I do, because it can show us something fantastical about the world. And I think that it's vital for everyone to have that.
Why do so few people understand how vital it is for them to have that? Is it just because they've been too little in contact with it?
I think it's also how the establishment and art also portrays itself. The fact that I think only one state school in England, it has art history as a course at A level, and I think it's such a shame. And I think that's what I want to do with my kids' book, is sort of show kids that you can totally be part of this subject. And because, think about how imposing these galleries look. Think about the National Gallery. It's like this giant neoclassical building. It seems terrifying. Even I get told off by guards. So what is someone else going to think? And I think it's just about saying, actually, this is for everyone.
But isn't it about more? Let me just push back on that, because this sounds so nice and so sunny. And, it's for everyone, and come in, and it's free, and enjoy yourself and see yourself in this. But if I am a 10-year-old standing, or a 20-year-old standing in front of the portrait of some prince or queen, or a still life from the 17th century, it's an alien world to me. And there may be something beautiful in the face of the woman, or in, the expression of a flower, but really to have access Or, take a work from a different tradition. I don't mean a Western Christian-centered, feudal-centered tradition. You can take works from Mughal India or ancient Greece or, the Maya kingdoms. It really doesn't matter. But the thing is, it enriches your experience of the work so much if you know more about its language, about the language in which it speaks to you, about what the artist included and what the artist left out and what the artist alluded to. And if you don't know that, it's a beautiful thing. But if you do that, it's an experience that's so much richer.
Yes, I totally agree. I mean, I had it recently. I went to Australia for the first time and I experienced First Nations painting for pretty much the first time. And actually being there and seeing it collectively in Australia and understanding how people made the work, how people looked at the stars and the landscape and how they wanted to kind of convey the language of their country through paint and collectively really kind of was spellbinding to me.
So, I'm not trying to harp on the old idea of a canon, but just on the idea that, knowing the language a work speaks enriches your experience of it. Knowing the context, the historical context a work comes from, enriches your experience from. It's like listening to a poem in Persian, listening to a Rumi poem. And it's very beautiful. The sounds of the words are very beautiful. And perhaps with a little translation, you get the sort of gist of what the poem might have said. But of course, digging deeper in who that person was and why he wrote what he wrote and where he stood in connection to other people or to the religious traditions of his day just gives it so much more richness. Or, the huge difficulties the translator faced, how to translate those things that would have been known to anyone at the time into another language in a completely different time. All those things are such instruments for human richness. And I have the feeling that neither the consumer attitude of you have to see this and I have to put it on your social media account and with you in front of it, nor this sort of patriarchal or sort of patrician account of this is important stuff and you must love it because it's in a big gallery, does these works any justice. So I would really like to see just a different approach to unlocking art for people. But it's an approach that I do think has to contain, we have to sit down and learn this language together. And that's going to be fairly hard. It's going to take a while because, learning a language is fairly hard and it takes a while. But if you learn another language, you can become a different person. You can express different things. You can perceive different things. Your life will become richer.
It will. Just yesterday I was in Oxford teaching with a friend. We led a seminar on Michelangelo and Nica di San Fal. And Nica di San Fal is in the book, and she's known for these kind of incredible bulbous figurative works that she calls her nanas. And we compared both of them, and we each, my friend John spoke about Michelangelo and I spoke about Nica di San Fal, and then we got the kids to compare them. And it was and actually giving them that background, and even if it's just 10 minutes, I hope changed how they saw something. And again, the context is so important. I mean, that's also why I make my Instagram free, my podcast free, it's because it's sort of giving people an art history course for free, and saying, here are the tools, go find them in the galleries. They're for you.
Well, Katy, I don't know whether you do still have a question.
I'm just so interested. I'm so fascinated by your books on hope and, Pandora and all these different kind of mythological stories. That's really what I'm interested in. And I'll have to interview you on them next time.
Please do. I do think that we're working kind of on related projects, which is cracking open a language and opening it up to more different perspectives and making that into a richer perspective. And I think you're doing that wonderfully. So listen, thank you for talking to me and thank you for talking to all of us. And you must all go out and buy The Story of Art Without Men by Katy Hessel, or indeed some of the other books she has written or will still write. And The Story of Art Without Men for kids sounds a fantastic present. I don't know when it will come out in different languages, but for now, Katy, thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Philip. Bye-bye. Thank you.
This was another BlomCast, the podcast that's looking at turning points in history. And if you enjoyed this, give it a like, subscribe, and talk to everyone about it. This is very much a podcast that wants to grow. It is, as Katy's is, free. Katy, what is your podcast called very quickly?
It's called the Great Women Artists Podcast.
The Great Woman Artists podcast and indeed Instagram feed will also be a rich source of information for you. I thank you very much and I hope to see you very soon. Philip Blom says goodbye and stay curious.